as well, Elise.
Yep.
Amazing.
Oh, there we go. It already goes as soon as we jump in. And oh, wow. Hi, folks. Welcome. It's so wonderful to see so many of you who are so excited to be here. That's great. I'm just going to wait a few minutes for everyone to jump in. In the meantime, if you'd like to throw in the chat where you're joining us from, I always love to see where folks are. Oh, and it's so good. I'm actually seeing a bunch of names that I know from customer care. So it's great that you're here. I'm really excited that you get to join us for the webinar today. Welcome, everybody. Oh my goodness, 146 attendees so far. That's fantastic. Sorry, Jennifer, not to put any pressure on. I shouldn't be saying that. There's just a couple. It's just a few. Oh, wonderful.
Loving to see where everyone's from. This is great.
Fantastic. People are from all over, coast to coast, literally. Oh, welcome everybody. It's so good to see everyone. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, and seeing lots of names that I know. It's nice to see. If we haven't chatted face to face before, hi, I'm Elise. It's really nice to meet you, at least virtually, so you can see my smile, and maybe one day we'll get to meet and I can see yours as well. Okay, so I'm just going to start with a brief introduction of Jennifer, as well as some of the other folks that we have here today. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. My name is Elise. I'm a customer support specialist here at Keela. I'm also a former Keela user from a nonprofit, so I've been right where you are. We also have my incredible colleague Chelsea, who's our digital designer, helping us out today on the tech side of things. You might see her in the chat box answering any of your technical questions, so please feel free to say hello to Chelsea. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that Keela's head office is located in Vancouver, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the coastal Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and give thanks for their generosity and hospitality on these lands and waters. You are new to Keela, welcome. Keela is a fundraiser CRM, meaning it's designed with the unique needs of fundraisers in mind and aims to unify fundraising, communications, and donor management into one single source of truth. Before I pass it over to Jennifer, I would like to welcome Alex and Bruce from Imagine Canada. Bruce McDonald, the CEO of Imagine Canada, is going to say a few words about Imagine Canada and Grant Connect. So take it away, Bruce.
Well, thanks very much, Elise, and welcome everyone. It's great to see. I've seen the names going through, and there's quite a number that I recognize. So wonderful to have you with us. So really, just a quick minute or two here to open things up. So first of all, thanks to Keela for their ongoing support and participation in bringing these kinds of forums together. It's wonderful to be able to work with organizations like Environics Analytics to present some of the latest data that I think you'll find really informative. And with today's conversation being around, the changing landscape of Canadian donors, one thing that I did want to mention and sort of call about some upcoming information is that back in 2020, Imagine Canada worked with a group of organizations to produce a report that looked at the participation of newcomers and second generation Canadians in their communities. And it really looked at their experience as donors, as volunteers, as individuals who are supporting family back in their country of origin. And as we think about the donor landscape today and being a nation that is continuing to welcome more immigrants, I think it's critically important that as we're looking at our own communities and the way they're changing and the way our organizations are evolving and changing, that this is a market segment that we're leaning into and understanding. And one of the reasons I mentioned that is that probably the most dominant theme from that report was a theme of optimism and hope about the future of giving in this country. And as you're going to hear from Jennifer, the trends are shifting. And one of the things that we heard back in 2020 was that newcomers were seeking to engage in their communities as quickly as possible. We're in the field right now replicating that by connecting with over 3,100 newcomers and second generation Canadians. You can look for that coming out in June. But thank you for taking your time today. Thanks to Keela. It's going to be a great presentation. And I'm not sure who I'm handing the baton back to, but I think it might be back to you, Elise.
Yep, you're giving it back to me, Bruce. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I'm really excited to see that data myself, and actually a few people submitted questions specifically about newcomer info. So there you go, folks. Report will be coming out in June, and if you're with Tila, we'll be sure to send something out to let you know that it's available. So should you have any questions during the presentation that you would like Jennifer to answer, please enter them into the chat box or into the Q&A section, and we're going to get to as many as we can at the end. And speaking of the chat box, remember to select everyone when you're typing in. So then all of our guests today can read your comments and questions. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. You're going to receive access to the recording by the end of the week. Now, I'm very excited to welcome our expert speaker for today, Jennifer Robbins of Environics Analytics. Sorry.
It's okay.
With 20 years experience, Jennifer supports charities and foundations in their data and analytics needs to attract and retain donors, corporate partners, and volunteers. Jennifer joined Environics Analytics, oh geez, I practiced it before too, in 2014 and brings a wealth of experience in analytics and marketing across not-for-profit, healthcare, and higher education industries. Jennifer is an active CAGP member, volunteering on the memberships committee, an AFP Canada member, and an AHP member. I don't know when she has time to do fun things. She holds an honors Bachelor of Arts degree in French and Marketing Management from the University of Guelph and a master's in Business Administration degree from Hult International Business School. We are so thrilled to have you join us today, Jennifer, and I am really looking forward to your presentation. So without further ado, please take it away.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much, Elise, for that really, really warm intro. I'm just going to share my screen. Forgive me, I've been having some awkward tech issues today. So hopefully I can manage this first try. Are we good? We sharing the right screen?
Looks great.
Looks
Amazing.
great, Jennifer. Thank you.
Thank you. So I am beyond thrilled to be here today, and I'm going to be sharing a lot of data. If you are not normally a data person, be prepared to be drinking from a fire hose. As Elise said, though, this is recorded, and I'm also happy to make the slides available afterwards. So don't feel you need to screenshot, write down all the notes. Yes, I do expect you will be overwhelmed by the amount of numbers I'm going to be sharing. So with that, I'm going to share a little bit about what we're going to be walking through today. So I know many of you have probably seen that the 2022 charitable tax filer data was released probably about 2 weeks ago now. Originally, this wasn't part of the presentation, but I've added it in because it's really, really interesting stuff and feeds really well into some of our data. We're also going to delve into what's going on in terms of the demographics of Canada, population-wise, older demographic immigration, of course, a little bit of the financial landscape. Things are a bit questionable. I think we all know this, but I want to actually paint that picture and give you some numbers behind this. And then, of course, some donation behaviors. What do our donors look like? So with that, let's dive into the tax filer data. And I've got 2 slides here. One is a graph directly from StatsCan, and then the other is kind of a summary of the key highlights. And a lot of them I'm going to touch on as we go through today. So first up, some of this should not be really surprising to anyone on the call, certainly if you've been paying attention to what's going on in the industry. On this little orange line here that you see, this is actually donation dollars. You see that they've been actually steadily increasing, and a huge jump in 2020 and 2021. Again, not super shocking, but they did dip in 2022, and that's not great news. But more concerning, and Bruce alluded to this, is that number of actual donors has been declining. Now, keep in mind, this is tax filer data, so that's not necessarily meaning that there are generally fewer people giving overall. It's just fewer people who are claiming charitable gifts on their taxes. And I will speak a little bit to that closer to the end of the presentation. But some of the really interesting highlights that I wanted to pull out here is number one, little over 1 in 3 donors are age 65 and older. This has been a common comment of conversation. So many of the organizations I work are saying, we know our database skews older. And I think no one is really surprised by this statistic. What I found extra interesting, though, is that almost 50% of the donation dollars, $48 of every 100 donated, comes from those 65 and older. And this is where I think there's a bit of a question mark of how this is actually going to start to shake out in the future. I also want to highlight those that are under 25, quite young, typically in school, and or starting their first jobs. They only make up 4.3% of all donors. And for every $100 raise, they're $1, so 1% of all donation dollars. So they're just not there yet. Now, the next point, and I'll speak to this a little bit more as we go through demographics, is that men are still and are more likely to declare charitable donations than women. Now, that being said, again, about 1 in 3 of all donations are made by women, and this has been steadily increasing year over year. And I expect that this is going to continue to grow and change exponentially. Again, I'll get to why shortly. Now, this one, not a surprise. I was not shocked at all by the next data point here about the median income. It is very clear from the work that I do with organizations on their donors, there is absolutely an affluent skew. You need to have extra discretionary income to be able to make gifts to charitable organizations. I didn't realize that the gap, though, would be so large, especially from a median income perspective. And then the last one I want to point out here is that BC and Ontario are leading the decrease in charitable donations. And I'm going to spoiler alert a little bit here. This has a lot to do with real estate. And I'll get to that when we start talking about the finances of Canadians. So with this backdrop, and again, this is from 2022, so we've had a whole year in between then, I still think that these key insights really fit well with what's been going on across the country. And so with that, let's start off with some of the demographic changes, very specifically population growth. So I think no one here is surprised that Canada's population has been growing. This is actually a really good news story from the sense of we do have an aging population. There have been significant labor shortages. The proportion of those that are under 15 are smaller than those 65 and older. So this is a good news story from a Canada perspective. We are leading the G7 group of countries in terms of our growth. That growth was almost 2% in 2022, and it actually was slightly higher in 2023 as well. What is not so great from this growth perspective, one not great, one great, is that natural increase, which is this little yellow line here along the bottom, this basically means babies born, has been steadily decreasing. And this is now sitting at, for Canada, about 1.6 babies per, I'm going to use the word eligible adult. And this is basically people who can give birth to babies. But the good news, so that's a not good news. We're just not having babies, certainly the way that we used to, but we're just not having babies. Where we are seeing the growth, and again, not surprising to anyone here, is international migration. So we are welcoming many newcomers to this country every year, and that is set to grow. I know there's been some changes very recently to some of the regulations. I'm speaking very specifically to student permits. There's been a cap implemented by our government, and that will slow down this exponential growth curve. And you'll see that in a few slides about what exactly I'm talking about and what exactly that means. But a lot of that new growth is coming from newcomers, and these newcomers do skew younger. So they would be basically you're under 45, so it would be young Gen Xers, squarely millennials, and then your older Gen Z. Now, I also want to promise a little bit of a look across the country, and I had to pull some of this out to include other really key insights supporting what we just saw from StatsCan. But I want to talk about some of the growth across the country. So really interestingly is Atlantic provinces saw exponential growth since the 2016 census. There had been a big decline there. Basically, I've been at EA for 10 years, a little over 10 years. And when I first started, there was this, decline in the population out east. And that has virtually reversed in almost all of the provinces, with the exception of Newfoundland and Labrador. And I don't think anyone is surprised, because I know that was a really big headline during the pandemic, as a lot of people were moving out east to get more space, bigger homes, a little bit more land. And so you'll see PEI, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, all topping that in terms of growth, followed by your BC, Alberta, and Ontario. Now, if we break that out by, we've called this mid-sized CMAs. For those that are not familiar, which is the vast majority of people, With technical geographic terms, a CMA is a census metropolitan area, otherwise known as the greater or surrounding areas of larger cities. So, for example, the GTA is a census metropolitan area. And you'll see here, topping the list of major growth will be Moncton's, Halifax, Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, Calgary as well, so on and so forth. So quite large growth. And you also see that the larger cities, Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, although still growing, they're getting outpaced by some of those, I'm going to say, quote unquote, smaller cities across the country. Now, the other interesting growth in terms of population across the country, and this should not be surprising given headlines throughout the pandemic, is we saw exponential growth in smaller centers, and we've called it resort areas or cottage country. I know other parts of the country say cabins or summer homes. Here in Ontario, we say cottages. And so you'll see here huge growth in some of these outlying areas. And I'm specifically going to pick on Wasaga Beach. I spent a lot of time there as a child in the summertime. Absolutely cottage country, but it's now more turning into a year-round. This is where people are living. People are moving out of major cities. It is not in this presentation, but if you're interested in learning more about some of these specific population shifts and where people are going, we do have some resources and some additional webinars you can check out. So this is the population. So we're in a period of growth, exponential growth in terms of our population, and this is mainly being driven by immigration, which I'll talk to in a little bit. The next piece of the puzzle, and I think this plays a really large role in fundraising, and I'll start to weave some of that story in here, is we do have an older population. We have our boomer generation, which up until probably about 2 or 3 months ago, they were the largest in the country, but they are aging. The youngest boomer is turning 59 this year. So as of 2025, boomers will be 60 and older. So that's what we're looking at here. And so I alluded to this when we were talking about the population growth, but I think this is really important to take a look at, and it explains a little bit some of the labor shortages we've been experiencing. So what you can see here, basically by 2036, and probably a little bit sooner now, we're going to have 1 in 4 Canadians who will be over 65, which is pretty significant when you think that our 0 to 14-year-olds are steadily declining. So this is basically saying we do not have the young population to fill in the gaps. And I know at the moment the economy is a little bit slower. We're not seeing quite so much in terms of employment. But if you remember throughout the pandemic and shortly after when things started to reopen, there was a huge labor shortage. And this slide here is really speaking to that. So from a charity perspective and a nonprofit perspective, the fact that many of you likely were struggling to find people to fill open roles that you have, this actually is one of the reasons why. And then if we take a look at projected growth between, again, the older population, I mean, this is exponential growth that we're seeing here, with the exception of our 65 to 74 in 2033 to 2043. And this is because these are Gen Xers starting to enter their 60s. And as you may or may not be aware, but Gen X is a smaller generation compared to boomers and millennials. And so you start to see that decline as we go out, 10 to 20 years from now. But really, the next 10 to 20 years, you're going to be seeing an exponential growth in those over 65. And this is a twofold effect. And I'll actually speak to that in the next slide. So I also, in addition to showing this exponential growth, I did want to break this down by generations. Because I think this slide is one of the most important slides of the deck, I think, from a fundraising perspective. This is showing a few different things. So the first, I'm going to start with our boomers, because I've been harping on about them for a little while. They make up a really large proportion of Canadians. And as you'll see, this is from 2023. Our 2024 projections are coming out in about a month. But boomers, they make up about 9 million people in Canada. Huge. Basically, you're almost 25% here. But you'll also see that starts to decline. 2033 and then 2043, a huge drop off. And so what I'm going to say here from a fundraising perspective perspective, for those of you who do not yet have a robust legacy program, the ship has left the dock. You have this 20-year window with effectively, with the exception of Alberta, and unfortunately I'm not talking about that in this presentation, but with the exception of Alberta, you are about to enter the golden age of legacy giving. You have these boomers who are sitting on real estate, have got savings, and we will talk about this more in the next little piece. But they're also, they have the nest eggs to be able to leave a legacy gift. And as you see, that population is going to decline. The other thing to point out is you see huge growth here in that millennial, and millennials turn, the oldest millennials turn, how old do they turn this year? 43, 44, and then the youngest are 29 this year. So, I mean, your millennials are about to exit their 20s. They're no longer super young. That's your Gen Z. You have this huge population coming up. And of course, let's not forget the Gen X, which they often are. But Gen X have just entered or in the midst of their peak earning years. And I think we often forget that. And certainly when we start to look at some of the wealth data, I think there's a few concerning things with Gen X that's coming up. And I think from a fundraising perspective, we should be aware of. Now with this, I'm now going to switch gears and talk about immigration and what kind of role this is playing and what's going on across Canada. So this super busy chart here, but what we're effectively looking at in this yellow is the literal count of newcomers or immigrants to this country. So you see a huge influx at the turn of the century. And then as you know, we're seeing this huge influx kind of from 2010s and up, huge increase in immigration. Now, the little purple line that you see there going along, this is describing the proportion of the population that makes up newcomers. So again, at the turn of and this is the 20th century, not 21st, immigrants made up a significant proportion of the overall population, whereas that's kind of petered out. There was a little bit of a climb again after World War II, but that's kind of remained steady, whereas that's going to start to rise given the fact that we're expecting all of these newcomers. And where these newcomers are going to settle differs wildly across the country. In Canada, we're currently sitting at about 1 in 4 Canadians are newcomers to this country, which is pretty large and it's really exciting and significant. And you'll see that both Ontario and BC were already at 1 in 3. So 1 in 3 people in both of these provinces are already newcomers to this country. And you'll see by 2041, this is projected to grow even more, with virtually all of the provinces, with the exception of our East Coast friends, sitting at least 1 in 4 Canadians. And even on the East Coast, that's looking to jump up to basically your 1 in 5, almost. It's roughly what we're looking at. So if you are not yet thinking about where newcomers fit into your strategy, I hope some of these numbers can give you some thoughts. This is, as Bruce alluded to at the beginning, this is absolutely an opportunity for nonprofits to build relationships with newcomers and start that conversation about supporting the different charitable causes across the country. Now, one of our new data sets, and I wanted to share this because I think it's super cool, and I also think it adds a lot of value to understanding the actual landscape. We have a new data set called New to Canada. And so what we do is we take the Immigration Canada data and Immigration and Refugee Canada data, and we are then projecting that out, modeling that out on the ground. So that is actually what Embryonics Analytics specializes in, and I should have told you that up at the start. But what this data is looking at is basically what countries are people coming from, and super helpful, especially when you cut this by the different geographies across the country. So you'll see here on this left-hand side, these are permanent residents. And so these are basically people who are coming to Canada to settle, to work, to build families, to basically build connection and community here. And this makeup changes, the proportions change quarter over quarter. You'll see here that we're looking at Q4 from 2022. So basically September 2022 until August 2023 is the time period that we're looking at here. And so you can see India is making up almost 1 in 3 of newcomers, and followed by China at 7%, so on and so forth. What I find extra interesting is when we look at temporary residents. So these would be student permits, these would be temporary agricultural workers. These also basically any sort of temporary visa that is speaking to residing in Canada. So not included would be visitor visas, for example. But what I found really interesting about watching these temporary residents is that this has changed much more so than the permanent resident distribution. If you looked at this exact data from 6 months ago, Ukraine was actually the third largest country. This is, of course, because of the refugees coming from the war in Ukraine. So what the point of this and what I'm trying to convey here is this can really help you understand what do newcomers look like, not only in Canada that we're looking at here, but also what do newcomers look like in your respective provinces, in your respective cities, and also where are they actually settling? What neighborhoods can you find these newcomers? So we've talked about what's going on population-wise. We've got this older population, which is very clearly represented in our donor database. We have this huge influx of newcomers. We already have a significant portion of immigrants to this country, which is fantastic. And we have this big influx of newcomers as well. The other big factor that I think is dramatically impacting donations and fundraising is, of course, the economy. And some of what I'm going to share is probably not news in the sense of many of these data points have been in the headlines, but I'm going to parse them out and break them down and share that story of what's going on over a time period. So this past year, we're looking at, in this case, basically year 2022 into 2023, it's been pretty interesting. I mean, we know that we are still somewhat grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic and some of the rippling effects from there. And I really wanted to make sure I give that macroeconomic view before we then take a look at what kind of donors are and what they're doing. So first up, a little bit of background on how we got to where we are today. So basically, since the 1980s, inflation, this is the first time we've seen inflation go up as much as we have. It's been a huge shock to the system. We've had a lot of influence here. So there's supply chain shocks, as we know from the pandemic. We have our war in Ukraine, which I've already mentioned. And then we also had a huge influx of money coming in from the government because of the pandemic. So a lot of different factors coming in here. Demand also went up during the pandemic. I think about so many people switching to online shopping, clicking, immediate delivery, so on and so forth. We saw huge inflation. You can see inflation here in the yellow. The yellow, basically the inflation climbed significantly up until kind of mid-22, and then it slowly started to drop off. And part of this is, as we know, the Bank of Canada brought in some interest rate increases. So when it hit its peak, inflation was at 8%. This was in June, July of 2022. And then since then, we brought it down to about 3% due to these interest rate hikes. Now, on the flip side, though, in this purple here, household income has not risen at the same rate. We know that savings rates went up significantly during the pandemic, again, mostly because of government influx, people working from home. So many were able to build up this cushion or safety net. And really, a combination of the income and these savings, we still know that being able to, that buying power piece is still being eroded despite the fact that we're now seeing these incomes increasing. Okay. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, central banks, especially Canada, rapidly increased our interest rates. And what I want to very definitively point out here, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse or not, but you can see this first rate increase coming up here in basically June of 2022. And it keeps ratcheting up all the way until the end of 2022. We have a few in 2023 as well, but significant increases at basically mid-22 until the end. I think this, more than anything, is what we're seeing in terms of that drop in donation dollars. And I'll delve into a little bit more why in the next few slides. But I'm not surprised to see the data dip that we saw at the very beginning when I was going over the StatsCan data. So Why the Bank of Canada brought these in, I'll talk a little bit about that and what it means, is that really these interest rates had to come up to bring down inflation. We all know this. And this does impact households quite quickly, especially if you have variable rate mortgages. So what we're actually looking at here on this particular slide is if you hold a $500,000, $500,000 mortgage, what these rate increases mean if you had a variable rate mortgage. They started off basically at $2,000 payments, and then they bumped all the way up to $3,500 payments. So what that difference between a 1% and then a 6% interest rates, which is huge difference in household earnings. And then one of the things that I wanted, one of the other things I wanted to mention, I think, actually, I apologize, I'm getting ahead of myself. But one of the things I want to mention is there is also a difference between variable rates and then fixed rates and how that plays out. But all of this comes to a really big head. Start to look at the holdership of mortgages, who holds what, and of course, rentals. Now, this chart shows outstanding mortgage balances by month and mortgage term for chartered banks. So this isn't all mortgages in Canada. This is about 65%. It gives us a pretty good idea about what's actually going on. We were quite surprised to see how prevalent variable rate mortgages are. These are the ones at the bottom here in yellow, and also how much they grew kind of just before interest rates rose. And so we wanted to take a look at that through a different lens. The previous chart showed how many mortgages existed at chartered banks each month, whereas this chart is showing something slightly different. It's showing how many mortgages of each type were issued at charter banks each month, including both renewals and new mortgages. So, which I think is really interesting. So you're seeing, those who are brand new plus those who are renewed. And it's kind of interesting, or very interesting, to see the mix of mortgage terms changing throughout these past few years. For example, we can see that there's a very large increase in variable rate mortgages in 2021 and 2022. We're not super surprised given that variable rates were hovering around 1%. So that's all this purple that you see at the bottom here. That's all those variable rate mortgages sitting in around that 1% or 2%. Now, on the flip side, the volume of originations in that 5-year fixed, which is traditionally the most common mortgage term, drops off a cliff. So that's that top orange that you're seeing here. So you see it's super large at kind of that January 2021, and then slowly starts to decrease. And you'll see kind of the end of 22 and then the beginning of 2023, it's super teeny tiny. So what this is showing is that people took a pretty big risk. It's not surprising that this happened given how much lower the variable rates were, especially compared to the fixed rates, but it's a little concerning because it is a high risk. You're taking a chance to take this out. Now, during the past year, the originations were mostly in 1 to 3 year terms. And this is basically households hedging their bets and really hoping for those rates to come down. So you'll see that in this dark blue, and then the lime green as well, is that kind of relatively small when we look back to the beginning of this chart, and then they get significantly larger as we come to the end. So if we now come back to this slide, this is basically showing us how those originations are rolling through the pipeline. And you can see here very definitively more and more households are being forced, their terms are coming up, so forced to refinance into higher rates. And some estimates are saying that about half of households have done so. Now, for variable rate mortgages, the situation is slightly more complex. So some of this we would have seen in the headlines, but there are actually two different kinds of variable rate mortgages and two different impacts. So the one would be felt immediately as these rate increases were coming in. So these would be people who have a variable rate mortgage where as soon as interest rates rise, their mortgage payments rise. Their amortization, meaning the length of time they have to pay off that mortgage, stays the same. So if you have a 25-year mortgage, that stays the same, but your payments balloon exponentially. And so that was kind of the graph that we saw a few slides ago. Those absolutely felt the pinch immediately. As soon as interest rates started rising, those payments started to go up. Now, the other type of variable rate mortgage are those who have a fixed payment. So let's say $2,000 per month. And of that, a certain portion is paying off the principal of the mortgage, and the other proportion is paying off the interest. And when these variable rates have gone up, basically that payment is paying more and more interest versus principal. And this then changes that amortization period. And we're not really, this is the kind of variable rate mortgage that we're not yet feeling the pinch of. So that's coming. Basically, what we're seeing here is already playing out, and this is feeding very much into that first stats can slide that we talked about, what we're seeing in terms of donations. I promise I'll build this out more as well. But there was a study earlier, not this year, sorry, late in the fall last year from Angus Reid that basically said about 50% of people are finding it difficult to make their payments on mortgages. Now, mortgages are not the only thing, and I don't want to forget about renters, as they make up basically 1 in 3 households in Canada. And so I wanted to take a look at what's going on in the rental market as well. And again, the point of this is I'm trying to focus and paint this picture of what are shelter costs, because they not eat into, they're absolutely necessary, but they do then shrink that disposable income piece. And if you recall, from our few slides ago, we're looking at that inflation versus income. Incomes have not increased at the same rate as that inflation rates. And in addition to that, because they've been slower, it's eating into that buying power. So all of these payments here are really feeding into what the general population is able to do. And so we don't actually have rental data here at EA. So I did go to look for some publicly available market data, and rentals.ca has a beautiful report on the website about this. And so what we're seeing here is very, very similar to what the headlines were sharing, if you recall. We've got on the left-hand side of this chart, rents were decreasing throughout the pandemic. So again, not surprising to anyone here. But what I actually found surprising, I have heard anecdotally, I know that this has been in headlines, but I hadn't quite followed as closely as I should have to see what's actually really happening in the rental market. And you'll see rental prices have increased exponentially. I knew they had in Toronto, where I reside, but I hadn't realized it was quite as extensive across the country. And so kind of this is a month-by-month average, which February 2024, there's a 10.5% increase. To me, this is wild. And that average rent in Canada is just shy of $2,200. Now, keep in mind, of course, this is being largely driven by major city centers. GTA, Vancouver, the Greater Vancouver area, Greater Toronto area have seen significant increases. But there's other places in the periphery, Brampton, Ontario, Victoria, BC, Ottawa, Ontario, Waterloo, Ontario, Guelph, Ontario, Halifax, Nova Scotia. They have also seen significant increases. And so this is, to me, quite concerning, because not only are we seeing this mortgage piece happening, but we're also seeing this rental piece happening. And the other one thing I want to point out specifically on this slide is that you literally see this turning point as well between June 2021 and August 2021, where this starts to tick upwards, and it's in direct relation to that increase in interest rates. And so even though the mortgage rates are affecting very directly those who hold mortgages, this is trickling down and impacting the entire Canadian population. So let's go back to the overall economy. So I know everybody, I anticipate one of the questions is going to be, what's the Bank of Canada going to do with interest rates? I'm sorry, I don't know. No one here knows, not even my incredibly talented data scientists and data modelers and financial analysts. But everyone obviously has their eye on this. And there's certainly some concerns. As we saw with the mortgage pipeline, it does actually take a long time for when these big rises starts to fall out. And when that full impact is felt by households. I mean, there's still households with variable rate mortgages, those with the higher mortgage payments, those who basically are virtually only paying interest on their mortgage rates. And then when it comes to renew, they still have the same mortgage balance, so on and so forth. And then when we factor in the fact that the American economy has been quite strong, there are some fears that if the Bank of Canada lowers interest rates, it's basically going to reignite that inflation flame. And what you see here on this slide, and specifically in this purple line, is that our economy here in Canada is starting to slow down. With inflation adjusted GDP per capita, that's again that purple line, it's been declining slightly over the past few quarters. So a couple concerning things there. And then the last thing I'm going to round this out by, because this also impacts donations and fundraising side, is that basically the stock market is doing really well. So it's this really interesting mix of things going on. And how this is shaking out a few things we've seen from the StatsCan data. But it also leads to some other interesting things. So I kind of summarized the two big bullet points from all of this economic stuff that I've mentioned. Number one is that nest eggs have largely remained untouched. So this means, even though interest rates have gone up and even though, quote unquote, the real estate market has cooled, it's not really cooled. Real estate prices have not dropped, I think, as much as what had been expected, predicted, wanted, based on interest rate hikes. And the stock market is doing quite well. The market is doing quite well. So nest eggs have largely remained untouched, which goes back to donors who are 65 plus who have nest eggs. This, I think, is really important and really interesting for us to know. But on the flip side, mortgage holders and renters are absolutely feeling the pinch. So this would be your middle-aged and younger homeowners. And then any renters are really feeling this pinch as a whole. So renters make up 1 in 3 Canadian households. There are about 44% of Canadians have a mortgage. So it's a significant proportion of the population. So what we're going to do now, I've given you some updates on the demographics. We've talked about the economy. I want to actually play this out somewhat in a scenario of what does this actually look like when we talk about Canadian donors? And I'm going to do this through one of EA's data sets. So for anyone not familiar with Environics Analytics, as I mentioned, we specialize in Canadian data. One of our flagship data sets is PRISM. And this is effectively taking demographics, wealth indicators, values and beliefs, behaviors, and creating Canadian personalities. We call them PRISM segments, but for this conversation, it's personalities. If you're interested in looking up yours, the QR code here, put in your postal code, and it will tell you which of these 67 segments has been assigned to your respective postal code. So what I did to prep for this, kind of build out this picture, is I actually took a look from our household spend data, which is basically a balance sheet of where all that discretionary income goes, like what do you buy at the grocery store, how much are you paying for internet, so on and so forth. And the CRA tax filer data is integrated into that for charitable giving. So the values we are looking at will be from 2021 tax filer data. And so we call it a profile. We basically ran a distribution of all of the PRISM segments and what they've given, their total charitable give. And I basically hand selected 3 PRISM segments from the top 10. So the 3 that I'm going to go through are in the top 10 of 67 segments in terms of their average giving to charitable organizations. So these are the 3 that I picked. Now, they're not necessarily as different as I would like. All 3 of them are urban segments, so it doesn't exclude smaller city centers or town and rural segments. So my apologies for that, but they are very, very different in terms of their life stage. We've got our A list, who is effectively the 1% of wealthiest Canadians, very much found in everybody's donor database. Also a significant portion of major gift donors here. I felt it was important to take a look at what's going on with them. They tend to be older families moving into that empty nester phase. And then we have our Eat, Play, Love segment here in the middle, segment 12. They're young singles and couples, but they're basically the young adult children of the A list. They're also quite affluent. They have very high paying jobs, again, in city centers. And I also wanted to pull in our Asian avenues. So they were actually 10 out of 10 in terms of those top per donation dollars. And they are your middle-aged, very diverse families. Many come from India is their country of origin. And so you can see here what that average total charitable give is. In Canada, the average is actually $841 annually. And again, this is from that 18% of Canadians who make a charitable gift. And so you can see the A list here, they're 6 times above that. And both Eat, Play, Love and Asian Avenues, they're about 66% above the average. I've also included their household income. For any of the numbers that are highlighted in red, this means that they're significantly above the Canadian average. Anything that you see that's in black, this basically means they're in and around the Canadian average. And then anything you see coming up in blue means that they're significantly below the Canadian average. So I already talked about life stage, talked about their household income. Also want to provide some of these key wealth indicators and really interesting kind of to take away. But one of the big ones here I wanted to point out, in addition to this home ownership, going back to what we talked about, but is this real estate to liquid assets? I want to point out our Asian Avenues here. Basically, what this number is saying is they have $3.30 in real estate for every $1 they have in liquid assets. So this is a group that absolutely has mortgages based on real estate value, likely high mortgages, and they are directly impacted from what we just saw in terms of mortgage rates, interest rates, and how much they're paying into those. So I think that's incredibly interesting. And this is how you start to really paint a picture of what's actually going on between different groups of Canadians. Now, of course, I want to take a look at giving and what does this look like. And this slide I found, or these data points here, I found absolutely fascinating. So in Canada, about 70% of Canadians say that they make a donation. Like Jennifer, you just told us, based on the stats Canada, it's about 19%. True, that's tax filer data, but this particular percentage is looking at all types of charitable giving. So this could include making clothing donations. This includes tapping at the checkout to give some money. This includes GoFundMe. Like this includes all aspects, all potential ways of giving to charitable organizations. And so 70% of Canadians say that they have done this. So you can see the distribution between the groups with, although Asian Avenues, we saw that average dollar is quite high, they aren't as strong overall as a group. And I think this really speaks to what Bruce was saying about wanting to be included in their communities. But if you see at the bottom here, these reasons not to give, they've said no one asked them. I think that really speaks volumes in that you have a group who's actually does give and gives quite significantly, but they're not necessarily being asked or included in that community. And I think that was really important to point out. And I also wanted to call out our Eat, Play, Love and the fact that they say reason not to give, they couldn't afford it. Although quite an affluent group, that budget gets shrunk, especially with significantly increasing rent. Now, quickly to round things out, just to paint a really holistic picture of these groups, I also want to include where you can find them in terms of that outreach space. Again, I've got the fundraising cap on here. Okay, we've talked about the impacts, but then how do we actually reach these people and continue to bring them on our journey? So I've included basically their marketing, their media mix. You see a mix of some traditional, definitely a lot of digital and social media. And one of the unique factors about Prism specifically and kind of what we look at donors is also thinking about their values and beliefs. So what are reasons or what's going to motivate them to give to different organizations? So I've given some top 3 values. And again, I want to point out Asian Avenues, one of their top values is financial concern regarding the future. So when I think about that large mortgage that they have, they've got school-aged children at home, they're definitely feeling that pinch as well. And I wouldn't be me if I didn't include at least one map of across the country. And I have 2 maps here. I'm showing Toronto, where exactly you can find these groups. So for those of you that are familiar with Toronto, you can visualize. But I also included Calgary because the distribution was very, very different. And so I want to round things out. Again, we've talked about demographics. We've talked very intensely and kind of worryingly about what's going on in the market. I painted a little bit of a picture about how these different pieces impact your everyday Canadian, everyday donor. But I also want to round things out with some of the key takeaways and make sure that even if it's something I said in passing, I really kind of tie a bow on it for you. Number 1, and this is both from a fundraising, from a charitable organization, but also a personal note. It is not just you. Things are a little bit doom and gloom right now. there's a lot of uncertainty out there, and I think everybody's feeling that. And I do think that there is room for optimism, and I'll talk about those in the next two bullets. But really, the big takeaway here, and especially when you're pairing that back with the tax filer data, is people with larger mortgages, i.e., newer homeowners, renters, are absolutely feeling the pinch the most. So keep that in mind with your fundraising efforts. And then, although the number of donors is declining, donation dollars are still up, a little bit of a silver lining. The quote unquote usual donors are still giving. So this is kind of a message of keep doing what you're doing, keep reaching out to who you have, keep moving forward because they are still giving. And of course, the planned giving note, in case I didn't make that quite emphasized enough, this is absolutely going to be vital in the next 10 to 20 years. And then my last point, focus on your people. Who are they? How do you communicate with them? Where are they? Going back to that usual donors piece, people are still giving. They may not be giving as much, but they are. And I do think that there's a lot of opportunity if you keep holding hands and keep extending that. Please support us. So I want to thank everyone so much. It is sometimes very awkward talking to a screen, but I'm looking forward to reading your questions, and please don't hesitate to reach out via email or via LinkedIn.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was fantastic. I learned so much. I'm a bit of a chart nerd, so your charts and maps made me very, very happy. Thank you for sharing those. So I do have, there's been some great questions that have been asked. So I'm going to throw a couple at you
Okay.
and let us know what you can maybe cover in a few minutes. So Melanie asked about real estate in Montreal, Vancouver, and Toronto. And does it have a direct impact on immigration? Do you have any data about that?
So we do. So I can share our wealth. We did a Wealthscapes, a full in-depth Wealthscape webinar last week. It is up on our website. I'm happy to send people links. But really, Toronto and Vancouver, and this is going back to kind of my earlier spoiler about why we're seeing this big drop in donors, is that in terms of net worth and discretionary income, both of those places have a significantly larger proportion of their income going towards real estate. And so that is effectively why you're seeing this huge drop. We're not so much seeing it in Montreal, and I will say that is that Quebec is very different from the rest of the country and has seen have very different financial behaviors, have very different giving behaviors as well. And so you will see that a little bit in Montreal because real estate prices have gone up, but not at all the same as what you would see in Toronto or Vancouver. It is a very different story.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And Alex he's working so hard in the background. He dug up that webinar from last week that you mentioned, and he's actually posted the link in the chat. So anybody who might be interested in that, just click on that link and you can get that webinar from, and it was you who gave it, right, Jennifer?
It was a little bit of me, but mostly my colleague Lynn, who she did a much better job. She's actually our financial analyst here. So she delved into all of the ins and outs of the financial pieces, and it's really interesting.
Love that. Okay. One of our lovely customers, Jessica, hi Jessica, is asking, is Environics demographic categories available through Canada Post list rentals? And what she means is if she's doing a prospect research or a prospect mailing, can they target, say, the number 10 Eat, Play, Love group, for instance?
So great question. Canada Post is one of our partners. So we actually bring in some of their data in terms of the geography, so marrying up postal codes plus some of the standard geographies from StatsCan. And so yes, actually you would be able to through them. We can also do that for you if you want to learn more and even discuss what you're thinking. I can also make some recommendations, and that may very well be through Canada Post or not. But absolutely can make some recommendations on exactly the best way to do that. But you absolutely can.
That's great. Another question that somebody asked today, can you expand on what folks/families in the different groups might look like?
Yeah, so, and I'm assuming you're talking about the three different groups that I shared today. So the A list I'll start with them. I'll just go in order. So the A list is very much your top 1% wealthiest Canadians. I mean, this is, and I apologize, I actually only know the very wealthy. No, I know Montreal as well, but this is basically your Bridle Path, your Rosedales in Toronto. This would be your Mount Royal in Montreal, and this would be basically your North Vancouver, West Vancouver, and not necessarily all households there, but a good proportion of the very, very wealthy pockets in those neighborhoods. They do tend to be kind of your 55 plus. There's certainly some older demographics, that come from, family wealth, so to speak, as well as your CEOs, your sports players. But they're effectively your 1%. They are most likely to send their children to independent schools, lots of travel. Again, a large proportion, significant proportion of major gift donors would fall into this category. Not exclusively, but significant proportion. Now, your Eat, Play, Love, this would be effectively your younger downtown condo dwellers. So again, I'll pick on Toronto, but the same can be said even in Vancouver. For anyone familiar with Toronto, there's City Place condos. There's several of them that their postal code would be Eat, Play, Love. Not all, but there's several of them that would have Eat, Play, Love. And so this is speaking to younger people, typically under 35, kind of your 25 to 35, out of school, but have likely pursued a career in finance, business, like some of your very high paying jobs. And as they're single people or sometimes couples, no children, they basically have really high incomes and a lot of discretionary income to do fun things. And as I mentioned before, as they're likely to be children of the A list, many of them have that philanthropic kind of values and beliefs they're brought up with. Now, our segment 17, think Asian Avenues, I believe, they are very much your middle-aged families. They are very diverse. This is over 50 to 60% from, and this is Stats Can definition, but identified visible minority. Even at that 56%, it's no longer minority, but that's another discussion for another day. And again, a big skew towards those of Indian origin, and not necessarily new immigrants. They may be second generation, and they would have school-age children at home. So they're fairly established, and they are living in urban centers, but they would be living in your kind of your periphery of the downtown centers. So I'm picturing like you would also find larger contingents in some of the larger suburbs, and I'm thinking of Toronto specifically. You'd find a large contingent in Mississauga, Brampton, and Oakville, but in more densely populated neighborhoods. That's why they have an urban segment designation. All three groups would be highly educated, and you already saw the homeowner breakout. But there's also full descriptions on our website. I probably should have started there. If you go to that QR code, put in your postal code, all of the descriptions are there. And you can delve into media preferences and other things that they're into, sports and leisure, and learn a little bit more about them.
That's great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. This has been a fantastic presentation. If your question did not get addressed today, Jennifer was already kind enough to say reach out to her via email or on LinkedIn. So please feel free to do that. I'm sorry if we did not get to your question. There were so many fantastic ones that were submitted either before or during the presentation. So thank you again, Jennifer. It's been fantastic to hear from you. Thank you everyone for joining. Before we go, I do want to let you know that there is a very short survey that's going to pop up right after our session. It only takes about 20 seconds, and it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill it out. It really helps us to hear your feedback and to make these sessions better for the future. We do have our next webinar coming up on April the 18th called The Fundamentals of Donor Journey Mapping for Nonprofits. I'm pretty excited to attend. Maybe you might be too. We hope that you'll check that out, and Chelsea is going to throw a link in the chat, but you can also find it on our website at keela.co. And again, thank you all so much for attending. I hope you all have the best Tuesday. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Jennifer. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.